Welcome, everybody. This is a technical seminar hosted by GIZ Fabric. I'm your host and moderator, Stephen Frost. And on behalf of GIZ Fabric, welcome to today's online seminar, the first 100 days of the German Supply Chain Due Diligence Act. If you've been following along with either the technical seminars or the general seminars that we have each month as well, you will remember that last year due diligence, the German Supply Chain Due Diligence Act, several times. And we thought it would be good to revisit this now that 100 days, a little, maybe not quite exactly 100 days, but close enough. It's been in force, and that's our topic for today. We have three speakers. I'll introduce each one of those in a moment, but just a few general housekeeping very quickly. So the seminar will, as usual, be recorded. If you've signed up, if you've registered, you'll get a link to the recording of that later. If you have any questions, please feel free to put them in the chat box. As usual, if you're directed to a specific speaker, please mention that in your question. Otherwise, I'll assume it's a general question, and I'll just ask all the speakers for an answer. Also, we'll have a small link to a small survey towards the end of the seminar in the last 5 or so minutes. It takes about a minute for you to fill out. Just some questions on what you thought of today's event and any ideas for future events. This is very helpful to us. It helps us to stay in touch with what you think is important. I'll remind you of that closer to the end of today's event. Okay, without any further ado, let me set the scene a little bit and introduce our three panelists. So, as I said, we've talked about the German Supply Chain Due Diligence Act several times, but never since it's been actually in force. And so it came into force earlier this year, and has a range of implications on issues like enforcement and monitoring and reporting for manufacturers in production countries, some of you who are on the call today. One of the responses from GIZ to the new act has been the establishment of responsible business hubs. And one of our speakers today will talk about that at a big picture, and then we'll also have a speaker today talking about the RBH, the Responsible Business Hub in Cambodia specifically. So let me introduce the three speakers. Our first speaker, so today is a little bit like a funnel. We'll start at the top end of the funnel with the big picture. Our first speaker today, Jana Stevers, is from the German Help Desk on Business and Human Rights, and she's in Berlin. She's been with the Help Desk since 2019, so a great deal of experience on these issues. She's an economist, international economics, sustainable development. She's had experience outside of Europe and in with development cooperation, as well as politics. And let's now start us off with a little bit of a discussion about from the German side. So sort of big picture or medium picture, you could say. Our second speaker, Ike Pedersen, who is the Senior Project Manager for the Initiative for Global Solidarity at GIZ. Ike is also in Berlin today. She's worked on these issues for a long time. She's been an advisor to the German government on human rights due diligence and sustainable textile supply chains. From 2018 to 22, she was managing activities in Myanmar and Vietnam on GIZ Project Fabric, on GIZ Fabric. And she's worked with governments, stakeholders, civil society, industry, fashion brands, etc. So a large amount of experience there. And Ike is going to discuss GIZ's response to the German Due Diligence Act and what GIZ has been doing to foster understanding within the supply chain in production countries that GIZ fabric works in. And then finally, Sarah Monti. Sarah is the Senior Responsible Business Hub Coordinator for EuroCham in Cambodia. Sarah is a lawyer. She's got more than 10 years experience in mergers and acquisitions, in international commercial law, corporate law, ranging from Milan, Beijing, Shanghai. She's now based in Cambodia. She's been an ESG consultant. She's been in Cambodia since 2020, and she's been associated with the Textile, Apparel, Footwear and Travel Goods Association in Cambodia as represented in the EU General Court over the EBA, the Everything But Arms withdrawal that Cambodia has been facing for some time. And now she's a Senior Responsible Business Hub Coordinator at EuroCham with specific expertise on sustainability and responsible business practices. And so Sarah will be talking about specifically how the RBH, the Responsible Business Hub, plays out in Cambodia, specifically as a kind of a case study example, so you can have some kind of idea. And that's important because, as Ika will talk, GIZ will be rolling out these hubs across production countries that Fabric works with. So Sarah will be giving an idea about what will be coming, because Cambodia is leading in the field at the moment in the development of the RBH. So I'm looking very forward to today. I'm eager to know what's been happening with the German Due Diligence Act. Of course, we've been hearing about it for several years. We heard a lot about it last year. Now we're really where the rubber hits the road and things are happening. So I'd like to turn first of all to Jana from the German Help Desk on Business and Human Rights in Berlin. So the Act is now in force, Sarah. Can you tell us how that's kind of playing out from your perspective in Berlin on a help desk? You know, what's happening there for you with the Act?
Yes, thank you, Stephen, and good morning, everyone from Berlin. I think good afternoon to Asia. Yeah, so we at the Help Desk, we are a free support service for companies on human rights due diligence processes, and that means that we advise companies on how to set up those due diligence processes, how to implement them, and of course, we are currently observing many companies that are affected by the law, either directly because they are within the scope of the law, or indirectly because they're
Have we lost Jana?
Yes.
I'm sorry about that. Our IT people will try and get her back. Let's just wait.
I think it's back now. Okay.
Yes, back. Thanks, Sarah. Sorry. Go ahead. You're on mute. You need to unmute yourself, Sarah. Sorry, Jana.
Sorry, I think someone muted me.
Right, sorry, okay. Right, we're back. Unmuted, go.
Okay. So I think, for the perspective for producers in Asia, it is first of all important to note that the law does not directly apply to foreign suppliers. Foreign suppliers will not be checked by the competent authority, and they do not have to report to the public or to the authority. But they are, of course, affected indirectly through those companies that are within the scope of the law. We have to remember here that since January 1st, companies with at least 3,000 employees in Germany are affected by the law, and this will be extended to companies with at least 1,000 employees in Germany on January 1st. And these companies have to implement a due diligence management system. They have to assign responsibilities for due diligence processes. They have to publish a policy statement. They have to analyze potential human rights risk in their own operations and in their supply chains. They have to address those risks with preventive and remedial measures. They have to set up a grievance mechanism. They have to assess the effectiveness of these processes, document everything, and report it to the public and to the competent authority. And these due diligence obligations apply regarding internationally recognized human rights standards and selected environmental obligations, but they apply primarily to German companies only. However, what we are observing now is that producers all around the world and in Asia as well are affected indirectly. And in order to understand those effects, it is important to understand the categories of supply chain actors that are defined in the Supply Chain Act. So the law differentiates between 3 categories of the supply chain. A company's own operations, so the company's activities to achieve its business objective, but also affiliated enterprises in Germany and also abroad are included in this definition of a company's own operations. And the second category are direct suppliers to German companies, so suppliers where a direct contractual relationship exists between the supplier and the German company that is in scope of the law. And then the third category are indirect suppliers, and those are suppliers that are usually deeper in the supply chain, where no direct contractual relationship exists between this company and the company that is affected by the law. But they are indirect suppliers in the sense that they supply to the German company through other suppliers. And the Supply Chain Act obliges companies that are within the scope of the law to set up these due diligence processes, as outlined before, for their own operations and for their direct suppliers. So this means that German companies which are affected by the law have to conduct a risk assessment. They have to address those risks with appropriate measures for their direct suppliers and for their own operations. And this is also expanded to indirect suppliers in case of so-called substantiated knowledge. And this may be a bit complicated now, but this means that the due diligence obligations are expanded to indirect suppliers if the company that is within the scope of the law obtains verifiable and serious information about a possible human rights or environmental violation at one or more indirect suppliers. And in that case, the obligations do not only apply to a company's own operations and direct suppliers, but also to a company's indirect suppliers. And there are several sources for this substantiated knowledge, but some examples include reports on a poor human rights situation in a production region, or the fact that a supplier belongs to a sector with particular human rights risk or environmental risk, reports about previous incidents at an indirect supplier, or for instance, through companies' own findings, so through grievances received, but this can also be through information by the competent authority. And I think what is particularly important to note here is that the competent authority, BAFA, explicitly mentions the fashion and apparel industry as one potential sector with high human rights risk. So in that case, the German companies sourcing from the textile industry have to extend their due diligence processes to indirect suppliers as well. So yeah, I think what is important here is that the law only has an indirect impact on Asian producers. It only applies to German companies in the legal sense, but German companies, in order to fulfill the legal requirements, they have to cooperate with their suppliers, and they have to set up requirements for their suppliers in order to fulfill the obligations. So in order to conduct a risk assessment for their supply chain, They may request information on their suppliers' business activities, on the deeper supply chain, and also on potential human rights risks. And suppliers may also be asked to participate in preventive or remedial measures in case human rights risks have been identified. For instance, when it comes to selecting suppliers based on social and environmental standards, or by including human rights standards in contract clauses. Suppliers may also be asked to participate in trainings, to sign a code of conduct, and to raise awareness among their employees and their own suppliers for human rights standards. And if human rights risks are identified at a supplier, the German buyer may also ask the supplier to cooperate in preventive and remedial measures, for instance, by establishing corrective action plans and by carrying out checks and audits to monitor its implementation. And one last thing, suppliers of German companies may also be asked to support the implementation of grievance mechanisms to make them accessible for their own employees and other potentially affected persons. So I think to stop here for a minute, it can be said that it is, after all, the German company's legal responsibility to implement the law, but this often requires cooperation of the suppliers abroad, of producers in Asia as well, in order to be compliant with the law and in order to fulfill the requirements from the German perspective.
Yeah, thank you. One question that occurs to me listening to that is, when will the first reports be due under this law? When will the first German companies be expected to submit their first report?
So German companies have to submit a report 4 months after the end of their fiscal year. In case the fiscal year is identical with the calendar year, companies that are in scope of the law in 2023 will have to submit their first report by the end of April 2024. But there are a few companies which use a different fiscal year. So fiscal year may also end at the end of June. And in that case, the first report has to be submitted by the end of October this year. This report only has to cover, in that case, the first 6 months of implementation. And then several of the due diligence obligations don't have to be finalized yet. The requirement is only that companies have conducted a risk assessment by the end of this year and taken appropriate measures by the end of this year. So this report can be seen as a preliminary report, because not all obligations have to be already fulfilled once this report is submitted. But I think the majority of the companies we are speaking to, they use a fiscal year that ends at the end of the calendar year. So they will have to report by the end of April in 2024.
And are the reports available to the public?
Yes, so companies have to submit the report to the competent authority, the Federal Office for Economic Affairs and Export Control, short BAFA, through an online questionnaire. There will be an electronic questionnaire provided with multiple choice questions and open questions that guides companies through this questionnaire, and they have to provide information through this electronic format. And then this has to, of course, be submitted to the authority, to BAFA. But companies also have to publish this report on their own website. So information has to be public or available to the public on the company's website as well.
I had a question, now it's gone completely out of my head. Talking about reporting. Oh, so yeah, you're obviously in contact with a lot of companies you're talking to companies. So as you mentioned at the beginning of your talk, the first stage for this year, it's only applies to law, and that will expand to include companies with 1,000. So at that level, are you seeing that most German companies are fairly well prepared for this? I mean, a lot of those companies would already have due diligence processes in place that have sustainability reporting or CSR reporting of some form. They'd have some sort of auditing and compliance mechanisms and management systems in supply chains. Are you finding that companies are fairly simple, or is it creating a whole new bunch of challenges for them?
I think I'm probably not the right person to answer this question, because the companies that we are speaking to, they are aware of the topic. They are interested in setting up these processes. So I think I'm really biased here. I think in general, we can observe that the larger a company, usually the further or the more processes are already existing. But there are also several companies that are also not even directly affected by the law, that have fewer employees, or that are located abroad, and they also have great due diligence processes set up as part of their sustainability strategy. So I think it really varies a lot, and it varies a lot by sector as well.
Yeah, yeah. I've got a question here in the chat box. I don't know if you can see it, from Klaus Telman Peterson. Thanks, Jan. He said, very interesting. I didn't know that BAFA had pointed as a specific sector that has substantiated knowledge of human rights risks. Where can I find this text, especially that responsibility expands to indirect suppliers?
Yeah,
Very specific question.
BAFA does not point out specific sectors directly, but in the there's the BAFA guidance on risk assessment, and in the annex of this risk assessment, they list potential sources for risk assessment on sector level, and they also refer to the high risk sectors as defined by the EU Commission in their proposal for an EU directive on due diligence in supply chains. And there are 3 categories listed as high-risk sectors by the EU Commission, which is agriculture and forestry, textile and apparel, and resource extractivism, manufacturing and sales. And this is just an indication what may be defined as substantiated knowledge. But I think this provides good hints in which sense this may be interpreted, and we always recommend companies to consider a very broad approach here, because substantiated knowledge, we always advise companies to interpret this very broadly, the definition of substantiated knowledge.
Says thanks, and also asks, do you have an English language version of the BAFA guidance?
Yes,
is there one available?
There is one available for the guidance on risk assessment already, and I think they are working on translations for the other 2 guidance documents in English. I can actually share the link for the English guidance in the chat right now, if that is helpful.
Oh, excellent. Yeah, I've seen quite a few things translated into English. Some of it is done unofficially, but maybe it's just a Google translation. Who knows? But I think there's quite a lot of stuff out there now in English available on this, because there's been a lot of interest in that. That's excellent. Thanks very much. Do you have anything else to add to that, Jana, before I move on to ICA?
I think one thing that may be important to note here, or what we always tell the companies that we are speaking to, is that some form of dialogue and cooperation along the supply chain is always very central here. The idea of the Supply Chain Act, I think, is not that small suppliers have to take the responsibility of German companies that are affected by the law, but that there exists a shared responsibility along the supply chain to establish or to protect human rights and to respect human rights standards and environmental standards. So I think if there's one thing that I would like to say to finish here is that there should be cooperation along the value chain instead of just passing on requirements and contract clauses, but real shared responsibility.
Well, that's a good point to stop on. That this is a topic near and dear to GIZ Fabric heart here. Dialogue, cooperation. We've talked about this on numerous occasions. I can see Ika nodding her head. This is something that comes up over and over again, and yet we continue talking about it. So, all right, that gives a lovely sort of intro into the top of the funnel, where things stand. I think we have some good clarity there. Now, going on to Ika, responsible business hubs. Can you take us through, just, you're going to give us a short intro to the responsible business hubs, the RBH, and the focus on due diligence. So over to you.
Thank you, Stephen, and thank you, Jana. I think that was really a great transition to speak about models of shared responsibility. Maybe before I start giving a bit of an insight into the RBH setup, just as a background, the Initiative for Global Solidarity is a support measure that was inaugurated by the German government as a direct support to the implementation of the German Supply Chain Act across global supply chains. And we have a variety of strands of work. We also look into the topic of grievance mechanisms. We look into setting up actually models of shared responsibility between brands and producing companies, and also improving data availability and quality for due diligence. So I'm just putting that out there because I've been asked in the past why we are focusing on the RBHs only and support to local businesses, but this is basically one strand of our work that I will be focusing on today here. Maybe as a rational or context for the RBH setup is, of course, this broader trend, this global trend for due diligence. And it is, of course, something that goes way beyond the German law also, where we're also seeing that other countries have or are in the process of setting up mandatory due diligence, and the EU is preparing a directive on that's going to cover all European countries. And what we're seeing, of course, and Jana has also explained that very well, that brands and German and European companies are stepping up their games and setting up new requirements and passing these on to their local suppliers. And what Jana also mentioned is that, I mean, the due diligence logic for us really should be seen as not just another compliance exercise, but as a driver for real change for improved conditions in supply chains. And that companies should use this process to identify areas for improvement and then to continuously work to improve the human rights and environmental impacts. And at this, at the heart of this, in order to do that, shared responsibility is key. But in order to be able to exercise shared responsibility, of course, a certain level of equal partnership and also understanding from the business partners and production countries has to be given. And that's basically the context of setting up the RBH, the responsible business hubs, as a basically a pendant to the German help desk also, with providing support and building capacity and understanding around due diligence in producing countries. We really see that there is a very strong lack of understanding what this new concept is all about. There's this feeling this is just another intensified compliance issue, and also that responsibility is quite heavily pushed into the supply chain. We see that there is a strong lack of understanding what appropriate risk management systems are, how systematic data collection can happen, and these data be provided for monitoring and reporting. And so that's basically the precondition for us to improve this is to build this local knowledge and understanding. And in practice, that means that we have been starting to set up together with local associations, local businesses, local chambers, help desk that have a quite dedicated service offer, on the one hand to being standardized in a way, and on the other hand also being quite particular to the relevant context and the relevant sectors in these countries, that provide tailor-made information on the global regulatory landscape, that provide direct advisory and guidance on implementation, that can refer to training and advisory by consultancies and relevant service providers, and that also take a very strong role in raising awareness and fostering dialogue between stakeholders around due diligence. So the RBHs are really considered to function as a gateway for local businesses that want to step up their sustainability performance and that want to comply with provisions deriving from the legislation. And that the RBHs are in the function to navigate this very changing landscape and support businesses in this endeavor for a more responsible approach to their operations.
And so the RBHs are going to be, I know we're going to talk about Cambodia in a moment, but the RBH is also setting up in other locations, right?
Exactly. So far we have set up RBHs in 4 countries, and very pleased to have Cambodia here today on this event. Also in Vietnam, we're working with the VCCI. In Bangladesh, we're working with the BKMEA and BGMEA. And then in a very different geography is Serbia. We're working with a local Chamber of Industry and Commerce. And then, as I also mentioned, this is just the start. We are speaking with other countries to expand this this network and have basically building on this very replicable approach, a broad network of support available.
And then was I before we move over to Sarah, was I correct in my comments earlier that the Cambodian hub is really the one that's out in front at the moment in terms of development?
Well, I don't want to.
Okay, all right,
but of course, I mean the Cambodian. I think the Cambodian and the Vietnam hubs were set up quite parallel. Maybe Cambodia was a few days earlier. Yes,
okay.
I think, I mean, we have been really doing that in parallel, but of course, I mean, the Cambodian hub for us is a very important partner, and we see that they are already quite active in providing services. And I mean, Sarah is going to speak about that in more detail. Of course, Cambodia is a very important partner here.
Yeah, I don't want to make it seem like a competition. Before I go to Sarah, I can see there's been keeping an eye on a conversation in the chat box about whether the questionnaire is in English or not. I have no idea, but I noticed Jana says the questionnaire is not available in English yet, but will be translated. And I think we can take her word as the final word on that. But that does. I've spoken to many people who have been looking for English language material on this. This is certainly not just a German issue, partly because there's so much interest in what's coming down the pipeline from the EU and beyond. The Germans are certainly not the last country to put a law out like this. There's more coming. Anyway, so that's good people chatting in the box there. All right, so we're now down to the business end of the funnel, which is really looking at what's happening on the ground with the Responsible Business Hub in Cambodia. So maybe just straight to you, Sarah, and maybe you can just introduce broadly about what's happening there, and then we can get into a discussion about what you think is going to happen in 2023 and what's on your agenda and so on. But let's just start off with what does the hub look like in Cambodia?
Yes, so good morning everyone in Europe and good afternoon for the ASEAN colleagues. First of all, maybe let me give you some data about Cambodia and the garment sector. The textile industry generates here almost the 70% of the country exports profits and generates employment and provides employment for approximately 800,000 workers. And the 80% of these workers are women. So for sure, the sector has a tremendous potential to contribute to sustainable economic growth of the country. I'm happy to be here as coordinator of the Responsible Business Hub in Cambodia. And also thank you, Eike, for the introduction of the main project. So I'm hosted by EuroCham office. So we are developing this help desk as hosting partner of Fabric Cambodia, and of course the Chamber of Commerce is a very good starting point for running the strategy of the Responsible Business Hub, because it's giving us a very high voice within the business ecosystem, of course, and within the business community in the country. We have also the support, a very precious support of the Garment Manufacturers Association in the country. And so one of the key aspects of the Responsible Business Hub strategy is to link and enhance the relationship with all other local stakeholders. That's why, if you ask me, so what is in the agenda for the 2023? Of course, there are a lot of public-private dialogue events that we will organize together with the governmental authorities in order to engage them more about sustainability topics and let's say facilitate the dialogue between the private sector and the governmental field. Let's say that in terms of services, as a Responsible Business Hub, of course we have a mission, and the mission is to support the exporting industry in Cambodia with primary focus on the garment sector, of course, but in the long run, we would like also to look at other industries like the electronics, for example. And we want to help and support the private sector here to be prepared and adapt gradually to the new sustainability standards deriving from the new regulations, as the German Supply Chain Act or the future EU draft directive on corporate sustainability due diligence. And of course, one of the main mission is to improve the competitiveness of the country in terms of sustainability growth. And we want to enhance the data transparency related to sustainability progresses of factories here. As a help desk, we are a free support desk. It means that we are open to everybody, so to members of the European Chamber of Commerce and non-members. And for this year, this is the first year of life of the Responsible Business Hub. For sure, we will provide basic advisory services, and we will have training sessions in order to sensitize as much as possible on the topic of responsible business practices. And we will provide a directory of local service providers with specific expertise on sustainability topics. And we already launched our official website, and the website will serve as an important platform, for example, in order to share all the latest developments and news and our publications on an ongoing basis. And we plan also to hold the Government CSR Awards in October this year in order to recognize also the best practices in the country.
Yeah, okay, there's a lot going on already. I wasn't aware there was so much happening already. That's fantastic. Due diligence has been there's been a conversation about due diligence in Cambodia for some time. You've been on the ground there now for a number of years. How have you seen the discussion on due diligence progress in Cambodia? You know, and what's the kind of feedback or conversation that you're hearing about the German Act in particular? So due diligence in general, and then the German Act.
But let's say that first, 1 year ago, EuroCham and GIZ Fabrik conducted an important preliminary study in order to understand, so within the factories here in the country, so what is the level of awareness about new regulations and specifically about the new German Supply Chain Act effective from this year. And so those factories that we interviewed work for both US and European brands, and so the outcomes, let's say, of these interviews were very interesting for us. Only the 20% of the interviewed factories were aware about the new upcoming standards and regulations. And let's say that talking to them about due diligence and about new obligations for factories in this direction, let's say that there was a little bit of frustration for a duplication of efforts and a duplication of expenses, because also the compliance process are also expensive. And let's take into consideration also that some of the factories in the garment sector here already conduct many audits per year because they work for, so big brands with already internal policies in terms of compliance, for example. So, and this feeling of frustration, of course, is because often there's a repetition of work. And this is a big challenge for us to make them understand so how these new regulations and these new standards are important. And for example, another point that we found out with this preliminary study is about environmental standards. And many factories, for example, admitted that the priority is still on human rights compliance more than environmental compliance. It means that environment for them is necessary, but not that urgent. Also because Cambodian environmental requirements are also relatively easy to meet, and most factories comply already with Cambodian laws. Let's say also another challenge in terms of data transparency, because I mentioned the importance of data transparency within the mission of the Responsible Business Hub, because we want to raise the level of transparency of data. Let's say that so often disclosure and transparency that are integral parts of due diligence process, of course, are perceived as, let's say, so negative, with a negative acception, let's say. There is a perception that numbers will negatively portray the factories. That is the meaning. And also another big problem for Cambodia, because I'm talking about Cambodian context, and let's say that Cambodia has its peculiarities and is a specific landscape different from other countries in the region. Let's say that another problem is that being compliant is essential but not sufficient for factories. Being compliant and having all the certificates make buyers confident, of course, but to keep receiving orders is all about being competitive in terms of price. And sometimes it is difficult to maintain a balance between the level of compliance and the price competitiveness. So these are the, let's say, the most important challenges that we face on the ground, as you said.
Yeah, that certainly, all those issues you raised certainly strike a chord with me. I was a little bit surprised though to hear that you talked about the survey. 20% of the factories were aware of the act. Can you just remind me, when was the survey conducted that you were talking about?
It was a survey conducted 1 year ago, and so it was among 15 factories working for very big brands, both from US and Europe.
Were you surprised? That 20% surprises me a little bit. Maybe not. I don't. Maybe I'm not surprised. I don't know. But yeah. Yeah, I would have thought maybe a bit more aware. But anyway, I find it very interesting. Was that survey, was that data ever released publicly, or is that just for internal use?
As far as I know, it's not public. The study is, I mean, so just an internal study. I mean, to
Right.
understand better the landscape in the country and to find the rationale of the responsible business hub creation, of course.
Yeah. Okay. Environmental standards, yeah, absolutely. Easier for companies to deal with at some level, because the targets are more easily sort of understood. And the data transparency stuff I found very interesting. Not surprising, but yeah, that's great. I don't know if you can see it, Sarah, but there's a question from Joseph in the chat box. Joseph asks, what service does the RBH offer in terms? Oh, sorry, I'm sorry. He's got two questions in here. I'm going to go to his first question. How many companies have already requested your services? What types of companies are requesting services? Large SMEs, garment, apparel, textile. What support services were they mostly asking for? What are their main challenges? There's a lot there, but.
But first of all, I can say that one of the first services that are required from us are publications and data disclosure. For example, we launched a very important publication in December, collecting all the data related to the garment, footwear and travel goods sector in Cambodia of the last 2 years. And let's say that so it is very important to have those data, especially after 2 years of COVID, where no data was available at all. And the collection of all these information, technical indicators, also it was a very big work, because right now data in Cambodia are collected in a scattered way and are not always available in the same format, and you need to dialogue and deal with different stakeholders and different public offices, for example, from the customs to the Ministry of Economy and Finance. So it was a huge work, but very important to understand the trend of the market, especially after the COVID-19 and especially after the specific episode of the partial withdrawal of the everything but arms regime. And of course, other services, I mean, very important that have been already required to us is to have access to the directory of local service providers, also because there's a high need of local capacity and of local experts that could help locally, I mean, factories and stakeholders. And another service is very important that we have been required of is training for factories. And let's say that training session about responsible business conduct, about due diligence process, about due diligence reporting are very often asked also by big brands.
Right. Joseph has a follow-up question. Maybe you've talked a bit about this, but Joseph also asked, what services do the RBH offer in terms of improving communication cooperation? This is something that Jana ended with: dialogue, cooperation, shared responsibility. How well are buyers connected to the RBH, or do they leave suppliers with the responsibility for understanding all this? So that's an interesting question.
Sorry, can you repeat the final part, because I didn't hear you well?
Yeah, what Joseph's asking is, are the buyers connected with the RBH, or are buyers leaving it up to their suppliers to connect to the RBH to learn about this? You know, is the RBH a meeting ground for buyers and suppliers, or are buyers just saying, okay, there's an RBH in Cambodia, you're supplying to me, you go to Sarah, you do her training and let her sort you out?
No, let's say that, I mean, so it's a long process, let's say, in terms of gaining more and more visibility at all levels of supply chains. Of course, we are starting now and we are trying to use all the tools we have in terms of network, in terms of connections, in terms of dialogue with all the stakeholders and especially with the government. And of course, we try also to use our partners to reach all the levels of the supply chains. That's why we are organizing and we are discussing now the training sessions together with the Center Institute for the Training of the Garment Industry. It's an internal knowledge center, training center internal of the Garment Manufacturers Association. And I mean, so it's a very important, a key stakeholder for us also to reach out not only the big brands or the first level of suppliers, but all the level, all the tiers, let's say, of the production lines. But it's a very, very challenging work, and finding the right communication channels is not always that easy. Let's say always, often also for different kind of communication language or communication channels that we have. So many sub-suppliers and many suppliers here in Cambodia have Chinese management and talk only Chinese language. And for us, of course, it's, I mean, another challenge that we need to consider, because we need to be prepared to have, I mean, a communication accessible to everyone.
Yeah, and I've got another question from Joseph. He promises it's his last one. But Ika, I'm going to come back to you on these questions with Joseph as well, just to see if you've got any sort of input from GIZ on these questions that Joseph has been asking also. But first, back to Sarah. Joseph says, thanks, Sarah. Great. Last question. What does the RBH do to convince manufacturers to invest in due diligence and responsible business practices? Have manufacturers started hiring local service providers?
Good question. Let's say that we want to help the factories here to understand that it's not a repetition of efforts. It's not a start from scratch, but it's understand how to link what the factories already have in place and what they need to gain, I mean, in light of the new regulations. And so this is, I think, the key point for make manufacturers understand the importance of the implementation of new standards. And I mean, this is a first point. Second point, competitiveness. Because let's say that suppliers that are not, I mean, compliant with new trends at global level, at international level, maybe will remain competitive in terms of price for the first year, for the first 2 years, but in the long run will be gradually excluded by the market.
Right. Yeah. Okay. Thank you for that. I'm just if you don't have anything to add to this, then just say so. But I'm just opening up an opportunity for you, Ika, if you've got anything to add here on these questions from Joseph and what Sarah's been saying.
Well, I think the what Sarah mentions is quite speaks also for the other countries to some extent. Maybe because Joseph is especially asking for the services already being used, we really see, I mean, we have just recently launched and we really see this big importance to focus on awareness raising to start with, to really create an understanding on the one hand about what's happening, I mean, in terms of the regulations and the requirements, but of course also about marketing of the services of our hubs. Yes, I think this is really the focus in this first step this year, or in this first half of the year, to go out there and create awareness about that the hubs are there and ready to help, and also to get further in touch with the business community. Yeah, and I think the next step, and I mean, Sarah also mentioned they are setting up an inventory of the service providers, and this is exactly happening in all geographies. So this is basically the next step to really working here as a referral to the relevant trainings and services available.
Yeah, great. While I've got you here, I know you've answered some of this stuff in the chat box already. You put in a link to the RBH in Cambodia. So if anyone is interested, there is a link now in the chat box from Ika to RBH EuroCham Cambodia.com. But someone asked early on, can the contact data of the RBH be shared, please? Okay, I've got the Cambodia one, but is there somewhere that people can go to sort of keep track on the development of the RBHs in other countries? You know, what's happening? Is there a focal point where people come to, or is there someone that they can contact?
I'm very happy to be the contact for the moment, as we are developing the websites in the other countries with all the contacts, and I'm very happy to forward here. I think for the moment, I think that's the easiest. Yeah, I will. So that's in GIZ, but of course in each country, then we are happy to share the contacts in each country, and soon this will be publicly available for all our partners.
Excellent. I've got a question for you, Jana, but can I just, before Andy's got a question for you, but before I ask Andy's question, I don't know how familiar you were with what's happening in Cambodia, but do you have any commentary on what you've heard from Sarah in particular, on the ground? Because I was really taken by your final comments about dialogue and cooperation and shared responsibility, which is kind of where we ended up with Sarah as well. Just interested in your impressions. Were you aware of what was happening in Cambodia to this level?
I mean, we usually always receive the German perspective in our day-to-day business, but I think it's just great that these support services exist, and we would always encourage German companies to also use those services and make their suppliers aware of those services, because I think that is just what is very helpful to get started in their supply chains, and to establish some form of cooperation. And yeah, I think it's just great to know that these services exist. But I think Sarah and I could probably have the best insights here, as we usually only receive the German perspective.
Yeah. Okay. I'm just curious to know. All right. I've got you now. So I've got a question here from Andy. Buffer established this window to receive complaints. What would be their investigation and verification procedures? As you understand them, when could we expect the first ticket? Wild guess. By ticket, I presume he means the first punishment, right?
I mean, we don't have much information on the investigation procedure yet. I think a lot of that would probably be based on reports that are submitted by the companies of publicly available information. But that is just the guess at the moment. BAFA says that they are going to investigate every complaint very thoroughly, and that it can take some time for complainants to receive an update. But I think they have established a procedure where they will follow up with every complainant, unless complaints are submitted anonymously, of course, then that is impossible. But we are also still waiting, or we are quite interested to see how this is going to play along with the implementation of the Supply Chain Act, that the complaints can now be submitted. I don't know if you've seen, but BAFA opened an online form where complaints can be submitted. So maybe the first tickets have already been submitted, but not made public yet. We don't know that because
by ticket. Okay, by tickets. All right.
Yeah.
Misunderstood. Okay, so the first complaints have been uploaded already.
I mean, we don't know. That is not made publicly because complaints can be submitted, or they are treated confidentially, I think, until it is necessary to inform the public, because of course information about the complaints can also or details about the complaints can also provide information about the complainant. So we don't know yet, and we are not affiliated with BAFA in a sense that we work with them on the complaints submitted. But the form is open now, so it is possible that complaints have already been submitted, but I don't have any further information on that.
And so just to make sure I understood you correctly, BAFA has not outlined the investigation and verification procedure so far?
I don't think so.
Okay. So this is a bit of an unknown at the moment. We wait and see, right?
Yes.
Wait and see. Okay. From Idil. Thank you, Sarah. I cannot download the Cambodia garment footwear travel goods sector brief issue number 1. Is there something wrong with is there a website?
Yeah, I already replied to that. I will double check and verify the correct downloading of the documents.
Okay, well, it's good that people are already going trying to download your stuff. Andy's got another question for you, Sarah. This struck me as well. I was going to ask you about this, but I forgot. What's the Cambodian government's reaction to the Supply Chain Due Diligence Act? Have they
yeah.
a position?
Let's say that we don't have a reaction specifically related to the German Supply Chain Act, but I can talk about a general reaction towards the new regulations in general about sustainability standards across the supply chain. Also because, in this part of the world, we are also facing new trends from Japan, for example, because, last year, at the end of last year, also Japan issued specific and important guidelines for sustainability across supply chain. So, so we are perceiving the global trend here, and let's say that generally the perception is positive, very positive, and we already experienced by ourselves that ministries here want to know more and ask for technical meetings also with us in order to discuss better and much more about responsible business conduct and how Cambodia can be more competitive in the future. Also because the country now is on its recovery path after the COVID-19, and it's important to achieve a very good placement in the region, and this is a very good occasion to be competitive in the global market, and following the new trends.
Yeah. Ika, are you able to, just following on Andy's question?
Yeah, I was actually. Sorry. Yeah, I was actually reflecting about it, how how this is perceived in the other countries, and I was based in Vietnam before, so I have also some insights there, and particularly in Vietnam, we could see that there is quite an interest, and Vietnam is positioning themselves. They really want to be seen as an attractive location for businesses, and as a reliable location, and they have, also, Sarah mentioned we still feel the consequences of COVID-19. We're coming out of that, but nevertheless, and global recession and so on. I think there's lots of challenges, but nevertheless, there is this strong interest and to understand. And GIZ is also advising the Ministry of Industry in Vietnam on their new industrial law, and there's also an interest to explicitly refer to due diligence as a concept. So we see there is an interest, but again, we also see that still the understanding generally is limited, because there have been many years of compliance-oriented relationships. And and also what we're seeing right now, in this first 100 days maybe of the German Supply Chain Act, is this so far that doesn't seem to change so much, at least not in the perception of the producers, which is of course not the intention of the German law, and also not the due diligence approach generally, but that's what we see at the moment, still how it's being often interpreted also from global and German companies. Yeah, but there is an interest, and I think the same counts then also for Bangladesh. Of course, Bangladesh is also very strong in positioning themselves. They are very eloquent in this regard, and of course also there is a strong awareness. But I think also a very strong request for sharing of responsibilities.
Yeah, one of the common stories coming out of Bangladesh in the last couple of months is requests from the BGMEA for buyers to pay a fair price which comes back to purchasing practices, that this is shared responsibility. You know, you can't ask us to do all of this and keep paying the lowest price for a T-shirt. Absolutely, and I think this has come up already several times today. But I wasn't aware before this call that Serbia was on the list of RBH development. But I don't want to get into. I'm not. You know, this is not the place to get into Serbia in any detail. But was Serbia chosen because was there a specific interest and a request from Serbia? How did that go? And then I guess my question to you, the reason I'm asking this question is, you know, if there are representatives from manufacturing associations from other countries here thinking, why haven't we got an RBH? You know, so how did Serbia come to your attention? Why Serbia?
Yeah, I mean, maybe I didn't emphasize that sufficiently, but I mean the RBHs work cross-sectorally, so they don't focus only on the textile and garment sector. And I mean, in the 3 Asian countries, there is a strong focus, but beyond that, we have also other sectors in scope of, among others, electronics and automotive. And Serbia is in this regard quite an important production location, especially in the area of automotive. To the German market and the European market. And that's how that came about. And the other question, yes, we're very happy to engage into conversations also with other associations that may have an interest to become partners or hosts of a responsible business hub in their country.
Okay, so anyone who's listening from Pakistan, etc., India, they know who to contact.
Certainly.
Okay, Joseph, who told us he had a last question, but had one more question. I'm not complaining. This is an interesting. Is it fair? So this is for this could be for any of you really. Is it fair to say that there are many subcontractors in Cambodia whose products go to the EU and Germany via China because of Chinese ownership management of the factories? Would that mean that these companies will not see themselves affected by the German Due Diligence Act? How open are these factories to responsible business hubs and its awareness programs? Or is it too early to say? Well, this is really for Sarah then.
Yes, so I would say first that how the line of production is developed. I mean, so how the supply chain is developed across different countries. Maybe Jana, you can correct me if I'm wrong, but so does not affect the scope of the regulation. It means that so maybe the difference is that so if a product is imported in Europe by China, maybe the difference is about customs regulations. But in terms of, I mean, regulations application and the scope of the law, I think it's always a supply chain, maybe with an additional step. Maybe Jana could explain better what maybe I wanted to say.
Well, I think this comes down to the substantiated knowledge clause again, meaning that even though or even if products are imported to the EU and Germany via China, if there is substantiated knowledge about human rights risk, for instance, in Cambodian production sites or in the Cambodian textile sector in general, it would mean that German companies who import Cambodian products via Chinese traders or via Chinese producers, they would still need to consider their effects in the deeper supply chain, so in Cambodian production facilities, and this cannot be excluded from the due diligence management system and needs to be addressed by the German companies.
Yeah.
And by the way, also China now is implementing internal standards about sustainability in supply chains in the textile sector. And there are specific guidelines also in China.
Yes. Ingrid says, thanks, all this is very useful, great information. Is there a central place, for instance, the Buffer website, where this can be found? Now it very much depends on what webinars companies and organizations attend. That's an interesting point. I think, Jana, that's for you.
Yes, the BAFA has actually a lot of information provided on their website, and they are constantly expanding that. As mentioned, the guidance on risk analysis is available in English, and they are working on translations for the remaining guidance documents as well as for the questionnaire. And I also have an overview of frequently asked questions that is being where questions are being added constantly. They have just added several new FAQs a few weeks ago. So I think that is the main source for information in this regard. And also for all German speakers in the audience, we are actually offering a webinar series on the Supply Chain Act, which will start on March 29th and continue throughout the entire year. Maybe I can share a link to that one.
Yeah. Yeah, I think that's very useful. I know it's only in German, but anyone who speaks German, I'm sure this would be invaluable. I think Ingrid's got a good point here, is that there now seems to be an enormous amount of information starting to flow, and if Buffer is collecting all of this, then that's where people need to go. Did you put that link in, Jana?
Yes, sure. Just 1 second.
Okay, good.
Sorry, Stefan. So, by the way, I double-checked the download of the sector brief on the RBH website, and my colleagues told me that it works with maybe better with the Chrome browser. They told me, but everything is working. So you can download the sector brief in Chinese, English, and Khmer version. But Khmer, I think, it's not very useful for you.
Right. Okay. All right. Thanks. Thanks for double checking on that. Jana's put some. Okay, she's got the Buffer overview. She's got a link to Buffer information in English.
And maybe just as the last comment from Ingrid, we're certainly setting that up, that we will have an overview about all the RBHs. As I said, we're just in preparation, and that's something where we will still need to create and see where we put this, but it will then be shared.
That's excellent. Are there any final comments from any of our panelists before I wrap this up? Is there any last words you want to just leave people with? You don't have to.
Well, then maybe just one note, because you mentioned it also earlier. This idea of fair purchasing practices, and in this notion of shared responsibility, and I think that is something that we want to emphasize, to always keep in mind when we look, I mean, at the German Supply Chain Act, but at the due diligence approach more broadly, that we really want to keep in mind that at the heart of that is that buying companies in Germany, in Europe, consider also the impact they have with their purchasing practices on the conditions in their supply chains, and that this is also a very important aspect, and this how they can positively influence the relationship and the conditions in their supply chain.
Yes, indeed. Any final comments, Jana or Sarah?
But I wanted just to thank you, Jana and Eike, because actually, so what they do on a regular basis is very useful for me here as RBH. And for example, so the German help desk, it's a very, very useful tool also for us to understand. So how to proceed, and so what can we improve and can we offer? So you are very, very important for us. And I think so the three of us today we are an example of collective efforts.
Yes, I think I can only add on to that. I think there are many support services available now that altogether give a great framework to take on this topic. I just shared a link to our website as well. We have some online tools that can help with getting started and getting an overview of the topic of business and human rights. And yeah, I think I would just like to thank you for the invitation, and also to Eike and Sarah for their interesting inputs. I think that was very insightful for me as well.
Thank you very much. Just in summary, I think what we're all waiting for now is the first reports, which will be out late this year for the first half of 2023, and then at the end of April in 24, we'll see another bunch of reports coming out. And I think, like Andy, I'm waiting to see those first tickets and investigations from the buffer, and to see what happens there. I think that's when we'll really start to see what really happens when companies get complaints lodged against them. That will be very interesting. So it just remains, all it remains for me to do is to say thank you very much for our three panelists. I think there was an awful amount of information there, an awful lot of information, and there's a lot of links in the chat box. So if you want to catch any of them, make sure you do that very quickly. There's a survey link which will go up from the IT team if you've got a spare minute, just to click on that survey link and provide any feedback to us that you can give us, because it certainly does help. Thank you very much, everybody. Look after yourself, and I will see you next time. Thank you to our panelists. Goodbye. Thank you very much.
Thank
that
you.
Was really, I thought that was really good, and I think that really clarifies the RBH role here and the growth that we can expect. The pressure is on, Eike. By the end of this year, we should have a whole ecosystem that people can learn everything, right? Getting there.
I think we're getting there.
Yeah, that's great. This is fantastic stuff. Thank you, Sarah. That was really good. Cambodia, a lot of stuff going on. I'll have a look at the website later on and download some of that stuff. And thank you, Jana. That was a really clear overview of what's happening there.